Playoffs? We're not going to talk about no playoffs? Are you kidding me? Playoffs? All right, fine. Playoffs, or a postseason of one form or another, have been around in each of the four major sports in North America for over 100 years now, and they have definitely evolved and expanded over that time. But this isn't about the history of playoffs. That's a video for another time. Today, I want to talk about the future of playoffs and what they could and maybe should look like in each of the four leagues. Oh, and although it will get mentioned, this is not going to be about how NCAA football needs to expand its playoffs past 4 teams. Although they definitely do. As I mentioned, the playoffs in the NFL, NHL, NBA, and MLB have changed quite a bit over time, but over the last 20 years we've had a relatively long period of stability in the 4 leagues as far as the format of their playoffs goes, with really the only major change being the MLB adding a second wildcard to each of the leagues for their playoffs in 2012. And sure, granted, the NHL did change back to more of a divisional-based format for how they seeded the teams, but the Stanley Cup playoffs have been a 4-round, 16-team tournament since 1979. And even the NBA has had a similar format, even with some seeding changes, since 1984. Meanwhile, the NFL has held its 12-team playoff, with the top 2 seeds on each side getting a bye since 1990. At least, that was up until now. Since the beginning of the year, both the NFL and MLB have had talks about making some pretty big changes to how they structure their playoffs and how many teams get into them. And all of that did come before this lockdown that we're experiencing now. A lockdown that has even the NHL and NBA scrambling to figure out how they can put together some playoffs and what changes they might have to make just for this year. But special circumstances for the lockdown aside, do any of these leagues really need to make changes to their playoffs, or should they? Well, let's talk about it. Ultimately, what makes playoffs great, or at least what makes a good playoff system, boils down to whether or not you want a system that is going to make sure the best teams always win, or if you're more like me and you want a system that is going to produce some more intense competition, where sure, maybe the best teams have earned certain advantages here and there, but in the end, anybody can win. As an example to what the difference is, look at the 2 big sports in college. With NCAA football, you have just a 4-team playoff, which does pretty much guarantee that one of, if not the best team, is going to end up on top. Meanwhile, with NCAA basketball, you have March Madness, a 64-team gauntlet that forces the best teams to prove that they are just that. Although to be fair, with March Madness, it's kind of the best of both worlds. I mean, while any one of the 64 teams can win, because of the nature of basketball and how it, much more so than any of the other sports, can be dominated by 1 or 2 superstars, it often means that one of the best teams are going to end up on top. And that is where we meet back up with the pro level. With the NBA and the NHL, both of these leagues have that 4-round 16-team bracket where, at least for one more year, more than half of the league is going to make the playoffs. But despite the similarities of how their playoffs are set up, who ends up winning those playoffs is quite different. Because with the NBA, again due to the nature of the sport, the best teams almost always end up winning. In the last 20 years, only the 2013 Grizzlies have made it to a conference final while entering the playoffs as a 5th seed or lower, and they were swept by the Spurs in that series. Plus, as you can see, in that time, no team that was lower than a 3 seed walked away with a title, and one of the 2 1 seeds won 10 of those 20 championships. In basketball, the best teams just always seem to win, almost to a point that makes you wonder why even bother having some of those lower-seeded teams in the playoffs in the first place. I mean, if the better teams are going to be making it farther anyway, do you really want to risk one of the superstars going out early due to injury? But more games means more money, even if the first couple of rounds are hardly even worth watching unless your team is playing. Meanwhile, though, with the NHL, while the top-seeded teams still do win the most, upsets and deep runs into the playoffs by lower-seeded teams are quite a bit more common. I mean, just for example, look at how in the last 20 years each of the seeds 1 through 8 have been represented at least twice in the Stanley Cup Finals, even with one, the 2012 LA Kings, winning the cup. And to me and many others, that's what's so great about the NHL playoffs. I mean, sure, the best teams are usually going to win, and they should, but you never know when one of those teams that barely found its way into the playoffs is going to go on a run and maybe even win the whole thing. And so there again, you have the difference between a playoffs dominated by the best of the best in the NBA and a playoff system with a little bit more parity in the NHL. And that brings us to the NFL and the MLB. In the last few months, the NFL has voted to add, among other things, 2 more teams to their playoffs. adding a third wildcard on each side and making it so that only the top seed from each conference will get that first round bye. A system that should go in place in this next season, assuming we have a next season. To be honest, I kind of have mixed feelings about the change. On the one hand, I really like tradition, and I thought that the system that the NFL had was a really good one. It rewarded the top teams without making it so that one team was heavily favored over all the others. Plus, with just over a third of the teams making the playoffs, I thought that a fair number of teams did make the playoffs, while still making it seem like it was an accomplishment to get there. On the other hand, though, I do really like football, and especially playoff football, so more games is pretty nice. But will the change make the playoffs better? Well, as you can see, due in large part to the fact that the top two seeds on each side have been getting a bye, the graph of the conference final and even the divisional round especially look a lot more like what we saw in the NBA. But even at that, some teams from each seed have been making it to and even winning the conference final. And even when you look at the Super Bowl, we've had a winner from each seed in the last 20 years. So really, the NFL playoffs have been offering us the best of both worlds. The best top-seeded teams do seem to win more often, make it farther, and are usually the teams that we see in the Super Bowl. But there is still plenty of parity. I mean, it really doesn't seem to matter if you're a 3 seed or a 6 seed. Those 4 teams that don't get the first round bye are winning about equal amounts, and even making it to and winning some Super Bowls. Although it does seem to help if you're an even-numbered seed for some reason. Although, to be fair, it has been since the 4th seeded Ravens in 2012 that one of these teams without a first round bye did make the Super Bowl. And with the NFL probably being the most what have you done for me lately of the 4 leagues, that may have been, outside of more money, what ended up pushing this decision to switch things up over the edge. But if the goal is to introduce a little bit more parity again and help some of these lower seeded teams seem like they have more of a chance of making it to a Super Bowl, I don't know that having a number 1 seed be the only team that's getting a bye and still getting home field advantage throughout is really the way to do it. With the NFL being the only league to have single elimination and also probably being the one where home field advantage makes the biggest difference, the 1-seeded teams are already at a big advantage. And then to make them the only teams that get that much needed extra rest week before their first game in the playoffs, I have a hard time seeing how the 1 seeds aren't just going to dominate outside of maybe a flop here and there. Ultimately, though, I think much like how the NFL's move to a 17-game season is just them getting one step closer to their eventual goal of an 18-game season, I think that this is just one step closer to their eventual goal of a 16-team playoff in order to match the NHL and the NBA. And to be honest, if that is true, that's probably the system that I would like the most, with the 12-team system that we have had being a close second. I think that 16 teams offers a good amount of parity and allows us to see more teams in the playoffs that we don't usually get to see. So I guess in the end for me, while this move to a 14-team playoff is probably a step down, I think it could still be a step in the right direction. But then though, not to be outdone, or maybe just not to be left too far behind, back in February, the MLB let slip that they had plans to potentially massively expand their playoffs. The plan that has supposedly been gaining traction with MLB higher-ups would see the MLB playoffs expand from their current 10 teams to 14 teams, with 7 from each league. This system would see from each league the 3 division winners and 4 wildcard teams make the playoffs, with the team that has the highest record getting a first-round bye, while the other 6 teams pair off and play 3-game series to see who gets to move on to the divisional round. And at first glance, I have to admit that I love this idea. The biggest upside of it to me is that 3-game series deciding the wildcard round. While I was at the time and still am a big fan of the MLB's decision back in 2012 to add a second wildcard team to each league, the idea of a 1-game playoff to decide the wildcard game in baseball is just dumb. And sure, a single game elimination works and is necessary in the NFL, but it just doesn't quite work the same in the other leagues. Especially the one league whose regular season is comprised mostly of 3-game series. So again, I am definitely very much in favor of a step up from what at this point just feels like a play-in game more than anything else to an actual 3-game series. Plus, I do have to admit, as a Mariners fan, the idea of a 4 wildcard system that would have seen my team make the playoffs a number of times since the last time they've been there back in 2001 is very tempting. Ultimately, though, I do think that a 12-team playoff is probably a better system than a 14-team playoff for baseball, for a lot of the same reasons that I mentioned with the NFL, but also some other ones. Chief among which is that I think baseball is actually built to be better when there are fewer teams in the playoffs than the other leagues. Now, obviously, there's a balance there, and I do think that the MLB has been very slow in catching up to where they need to be as far as the number of teams in their playoffs. But baseball is unlike the other sports in that teams can be built to be better in the playoffs than they are in the regular season. And no, I'm not talking about grit or toughness or which team is more clutch or any of those other unmeasurable subjective qualities. Put simply, it's because of pitching, especially starting pitching. In the other sports, every player, especially the best players, can play in every game. But in baseball, that's just not the case. Pitchers can't perform their duties day in and day out. During the regular season, this is easily managed by having a 5-man rotation, so each guy only pitches every 5 days or so, and in some cases even having carefully managed pitch counts. But in the postseason, all that is out the window. And sure, nobody's going to start back-to-back games or even 2 out of 3 games for the most part. But if your ace can pitch every 3rd game and maybe even come out of the bullpen from time to time, then he definitely is going to. So, say for example you have a team that has 2, maybe 3 really top level starters, and then 2 guys that are kind of liabilities at the back end of the rotation. During the regular season, when all 5 guys have to pitch, that team might not do as well as a team that has 5 solid starters but really doesn't have those top level guys at the front. But then when playoffs roll around and suddenly they can just pitch their top 3 guys, suddenly that team with the better front end of their rotation is the better team. This is a strategy that plenty of franchises have taken advantage of over the years, and is part of the reason that the MLB graphs seem to have so much more parity than the other leagues, and even to a point where the 4 seeds are almost as successful as the 1 seeds in the later rounds. So with that in mind, that's why if you have almost half of the league with 14 of 30 teams making the playoffs, it encourages some teams that know they aren't going to compete for that 1 seed to just try and build their teams this way. And sure, they aren't all going to be able to succeed, but some of them will. And if you are just purely a fan of chaos in the playoffs, then this is definitely for you. But it does take away quite a bit from those who like to have the regular season mean a little bit more and see the best teams make it the farthest. But who knows, maybe it wouldn't really change things that much, and maybe franchises wouldn't start constructing their teams differently if they knew they had a better chance at making the playoffs. And if that is the case, then it would certainly be better for the health of the game to get more franchises involved in the playoffs and get more fan bases invested in them. Either way though, the plan won't go through until 2022 at the earliest, and the MLB has a bit of a reputation for being one of the more slowly moving leagues, so even that does seem a little bit early. But it is still fun to think about, even if for now, it is what it is. As always, if you have made it to this point, thank you for watching. If you did like this video, please let me know about that by hitting the thumbs up down below. If you really like this video and want to see more of my content, please hit the subscribe button down below as well. And finally, if you have anything you'd like to add, any suggestions for future videos, or if you just want to take exception to something I said, please let me know about that down in the comment section below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Stay safe. Peace.